Winter, 1887, Montana. The mountains were buried in snow so deep that even the wind seemed to lose its way among them. On a quiet stretch of land far from any town stood a small log cabin, smoke curling from its chimney like the last sign of life in a world gone white and silent. On the porch of that cabin stood Emily Carter, 20 years old, her eyes wet with tears, her hands trembling around 3 red roses. Daniel, her husband, had given her those roses on their wedding day. Now they shook in her fingers as if even the flowers knew something terrible was coming. The story begins 3 months earlier when Emily and Daniel first made this ranch their home. Daniel was a hard-working farmer who turned the frozen soil with his own hands every morning before the sun rose. Emily was a doctor's daughter who had left behind the comforts of the city for a love she couldn't imagine living without. Their affection was the quiet kind. Daniel brought her wildflowers he found near the woods, and at night, by lantern light, Emily read him stories from the books she'd carried west in a single wooden trunk. Living with them was Emily's younger brother, Thomas, only 16, who had come to live with his sister after their parents passed away. To Thomas, Daniel wasn't just a brother-in-law, he'd become the father he'd lost too soon. Life on the ranch was hard, but it was full, warm, and theirs. Then came the night everything changed. A brutal blizzard swept through the region, burying the roads, snapping the telegraph lines, cutting the ranch off from the rest of the world entirely. For the first 2 weeks, their stored grain and dried meat were enough, but when the storm refused to end, things began to fall apart. Daniel had gone out to gather firewood when a falling branch struck his leg. The wound wouldn't stop bleeding. Emily, drawing on everything her father had ever taught her, tried desperately to treat it, but without proper medicine, without a real doctor, without even clean water that wasn't frozen solid, the infection spread faster than her hope could keep up. Thomas rode out twice trying to reach the nearest town, and twice the storm turned him back, his hands blue, his horse exhausted, his eyes full of a fear he tried to hide from his sister. Each time he returned empty-handed, Emily would hold his face in her hands and whisper that it wasn't his fault, even as her own heart cracked a little more. Daniel grew weaker by the day. He never once complained. Even as the fever burned through him, he'd smile at Emily and tell her that marrying her was still the best decision he ever made. He asked Thomas to look after his sister the way a man looks after the only family he has left. He said it so gently, so simply, that neither of them realized he was already saying goodbye. On the 9th day of the storm, the wind finally broke. Thin sunlight cut through the gray sky for the first time in what felt like forever. Thomas, half frozen but not broken, mounted his horse one last time and rode until his lungs burned, until he finally reached a passing rider from the next town who carried word to a doctor. But some races are lost not because of distance, but because of time itself. By the time help arrived, Daniel was too far gone. He asked for one last thing, that Emily hold the 3 roses he'd given her on their wedding day, the ones she'd kept pressed and dried in her Bible ever since. He wanted her to remember, he said, that even in the coldest winter, something beautiful had still managed to grow between them. He passed away just as the morning light touched the window, the same light in which Emily now stood on the porch, roses in hand, tears silently falling, her husband's horse saddled and waiting beside her, as if it too didn't understand why its rider hadn't come to claim it. Thomas stood a few feet away, hat in hand, unable to look at his sister's grief without feeling his own. He had ridden through a storm to save the man who had become his father, and he had made it back only moments too late. That guilt would live with him quietly for the rest of his life, but so would something else, the memory of a man who, even while dying, thought only of making sure the people he loved would be okay.
Emily buried Daniel on a small hill overlooking the ranch, the same hill where he used to sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down over the fields he'd worked so hard to build. She placed the 3 roses on the fresh grave, and for a long moment she simply stood there, not as a broken woman, but as someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, what it truly meant to have loved someone completely.
Spring eventually came, as it always does, even after the harshest winters. The snow melted, the fields turned green again, and Emily and Thomas stayed on the ranch, not because it was easy, but because leaving would have meant leaving Daniel behind twice. Every year, on the day of the first snowfall, Emily would walk up that hill with 3 fresh roses in her hand, remembering not the pain of losing him, but the quiet, steady love that had once filled that little cabin with warmth strong enough to survive a Montana winter. What this story teaches us is simple but powerful. Real love isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by how deeply it's felt. And even in life's harshest storms, human courage and quiet sacrifice can leave behind something that outlives us all.